Marcus Henderson did not look like a man who was about to change the way the county thought about water. He looked like a man who had spent too much time under a relentless sun, his skin the color of well-worn saddle leather and his eyes the shade of a late August sky just before a storm breaks. He stood in the middle of a dry, dusty patch of earth on the eastern edge of his property, holding a lengths of twine and several sharpened cedar stakes. To his neighbors in the small town of Oak Haven, Marcus was a man of few words and even fewer conventional ideas. They watched from the gravel road, leaning against their rusted pickup trucks, shaking their heads as Marcus began to pace out a geometric shape that made no sense to anyone who had ever dug a well in the Nebraska Panhandle. Old Silas, who had farmed the adjacent 300 acres for nearly 50 years, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt and wiped his mouth with the back of a calloused hand. He called out to Marcus, his voice carrying easily over the quiet, wind-blown prairie. He asked Marcus why he was wasting his time drawing shapes in the dirt when the water table was dropping lower than a stone in a canyon. Silas told him that a well was a circle, always had been and always would be, because nature liked circles and circles held up against the weight of the earth. He laughed and told the other men that Marcus was trying to summon the stars down into the ground instead of pulling the water up. The other men chuckled, their voices a low rumble of skepticism. They told Marcus he was digging a grave for his reputation and that he'd be better off hauling water from the county line like everyone else whose pumps had started sucking sand. Marcus didn't look up. He didn't offer a defense or a lecture on the physics of hydraulic pressure. He simply hammered the first stake into the hard-packed clay. He could have listened to them. He could have followed the tradition of every homesteading family since the 1800s. He could have dug a standard 4-foot diameter cylinder and hoped for a vein of moisture that hadn't already been depleted by the industrial farms to the north. But he didn't. Marcus Henderson knew something about the way water moved through the deep, hidden fractures of the earth that the others hadn't bothered to learn. He knew that the land was changing, and that the old ways were no longer enough to keep a family fed and the livestock watered. The backstory of Marcus's obsession with water began decades earlier, long before the current dry spell had turned the creek beds into cracked ribbons of gray mud. He had served in the Army Corps of Engineers, stationed in regions where water was more valuable than gold and twice as hard to find. He had studied the ancient Canaanites of the Middle East and the steppe wells of India, marveling at how civilizations survived for millennia in arid wastes. When he returned to the family farm after his father passed away, he brought with him a crate of notebooks filled with sketches of fractal patterns and fluid dynamics. He spent his evenings under a dim lamp, calculating the surface area to volume ratio of various polygons. He realized that a circular well, while structurally sound, offered the minimum amount of surface contact with the surrounding aquifer. In a time of abundance, that didn't matter. In a time of scarcity, it was a fatal design flaw. Marcus spent 3 years researching the specific geology of his acreage. He took soil samples at 20 different locations, analyzing the silt, the clay, and the underlying limestone. He discovered that his land sat atop a convergence of 3 minor subterranean flows, but they were trapped in tight, vertical fissures. A standard well might miss them by inches, or only draw from one at a time. He needed a structure that acted like a net, something that could intercept water from multiple directions simultaneously. The 6-pointed star, an unconventional hexagram of deep trenching points, was the answer. By creating 6 distinct arms that reached out from a central hub, he would increase the seepage surface area by nearly 400% compared to a traditional well of the same volume. The planning process was meticulous. Marcus used a transit level and a series of plumb bobs to ensure the angles were perfect. Each point of the star had to be exactly 60 degrees. If the angles were off, the structural integrity would be compromised and the pressure of the earth would collapse the walls before he ever hit the water table. He calculated that he needed to reach a depth of 45 feet to ensure a year-round supply, even if the regional aquifer dropped another 10 feet. His neighbors watched him spend weeks just measuring and marking, their mockery turning into a kind of pity. They saw him as a man who had lost his grip on reality, a man who was fighting a war against the very physics of the plains. When the digging finally began in the early spring, Marcus worked alone. He used a modified pickaxe and a series of hand shovels, refusing to use a heavy drilling rig that might compact the soil and seal off the very fissures he was trying to tap. The work was grueling. The first 10 feet were a battle against sun-baked clay that was as hard as concrete. Every strike of the pick sent a jarring vibration through his arms and into his teeth. He measured his progress in inches, not feet. He would dig out the central hexagonal core first, then painstakingly carve out the 6 radiating points. By the second week, the shape was clearly visible from the ridge. It looked like a giant, sharp-edged star had been branded into the earth. The community took to calling it Henderson's Folly. People would drive out of their way just to see the man in the hole. They would stand at the edge peering down at Marcus, who was usually covered in a fine layer of red dust. They asked him if he was building a basement for a church or a trap for a monster. One neighbor, a man named Miller who ran the local hardware store, told Marcus that he was selling more PVC pipe to people who were actually finding water than he was to men who were playing in the dirt with stars. Marcus would just nod, wipe the sweat from his brow, and keep digging. The technical innovations Marcus employed were as strange as the shape of the well itself. To prevent the walls from collapsing and the soft sand layers he hit at 15 feet, he didn't use standard concrete rings. Instead, he crafted custom-fitted slabs of porous volcanic rock that he had shipped in from the west. He hand-carved these slabs to fit the sharp angles of the stars' points. These rocks acted as a natural filter and allowed water to seep through the entire surface area of the wall, rather than just through the bottom of the well. He reinforced the valleys between the points with reclaimed railroad ties, creating a bracing system that used the Earth's own inward pressure to lock the star-shaped structure into place. The setbacks were frequent and demoralizing. At 20 feet, Marcus hit a layer of prehistoric granite that his hand tools couldn't penetrate. For 3 days, he sat at the kitchen table, staring at his maps, the silence of the house weighing heavy on him. He could have quit. He could have admitted the neighbors were right and filled the hole back in, but he didn't. He went into town, rented a specialized pneumatic breaker, and spent 72 hours of bone-shaking labor shattering the stone. The vibrations were so intense they rattled the windows of his farmhouse, and Silas complained that Marcus was going to scare the milk right out of his cows. As the weeks turned into months, the physical toll on Marcus became evident. He lost 20 pounds, his frame becoming lean and wiry. His hands were a map of scars and calluses, and his back had a permanent ache that no amount of liniment could soothe. But the deeper he went, the more the air in the hole changed. It became cool and damp, smelling of old shadows and the breath of the earth. At 30 feet, the first signs of success appeared. It wasn't a gush of water, but a slow, steady weeping from the eastern point of the star. The clay felt tacky, then muddy. Marcus stood in the dark, 30 feet below the surface, and felt the moisture against his skin. It was the first validation of his theory. The star was working. It was intercepting a minor fissure that a circular well would have missed by 3 feet. Despite this small victory, the skepticism from Oak Haven only intensified. The town was experiencing the driest spring in recorded history. The local reservoir was at 40% capacity, and the city council had already implemented Stage 3 water restrictions. People were on edge, watching their lawns turn to straw and their gardens wither. They looked at Marcus's star-shaped project not as a potential solution, but as a symptom of a world that no longer made sense. They didn't understand that Marcus wasn't just digging a hole. He was building a cathedral for the most precious resource on the planet. Marcus began the final phase of the build as the heat of June settled over the plains like a heavy wool blanket. The temperature at the surface regularly hit 100 degrees by noon, but inside the star-shaped well, it remained a constant, chilling 55 degrees. He was now 40 feet down. The structure was magnificent in its own brutal way. The 6 points reached out like the fingers of a hand, grasping for the lifeblood of the land. He had finished the lining using a specialized mortar mix that included crushed charcoal to further purify any water that entered. He installed a hand-cranked pulley system and a series of copper pipes that would lead to a storage tank behind the house. Every measurement was checked and rechecked. The points of the star were aligned with the primary subterranean fractures he had mapped years ago. He had calculated the flow rate based on the porosity of his volcanic rock lining. If his math was correct, the well would be able to recharge at a rate of 500 gallons an hour, even without a pump. It was a gravity-fed, high-surface area collection system that relied on the very weight of the Earth to push water into the central chamber. The final day of digging came on a Tuesday. Marcus struck the bottom of the aquifer at 47 feet. It wasn't a trickle this time, it was a surge. The water bubbled up through the floor of the well, cold and clear, filling the central hexagon within minutes. As it rose, it began to pour in from the 6 points of the star, creating a rhythmic, splashing sound that echoed up the shaft. Marcus climbed the ladder as the water chased his boots, his heart hammering against his ribs. When he reached the surface and looked down, he saw the reflection of the midday sun hitting the rising water. The star was glowing. He didn't celebrate with a party or a parade. He simply walked to the storage tank, turned the valve, and watched as the first gallons of water began to flow. It was pure, sweet, and colder than anything the municipal pipes could provide. He sat on the edge of the well, his feet dangling over the side, and watched the water level stabilize exactly where he had predicted. He had done it, but the real test was yet to come. The drought wasn't just a spring dry spell. It was the beginning of a historic environmental crisis that would bring the entire region to its knees. By July, the heat had become a physical weight. The sky was a pale, dusty blue, devoid of even the hint of a cloud. The corn in the surrounding fields was stunted, its leaves curling into tight, brown needles. In town, the talk was no longer about Marcus's folly, it was about survival. The municipal well had begun to fail, and the deeper agricultural wells were pulling up nothing but brackish sludge. The tension in Oakhaven was thick enough to taste. People were desperate, and desperation often leads to anger. They looked at Marcus's green garden, the only green spot for 50 miles, with a mixture of awe and resentment. They couldn't understand how a man with a star hole had water when the giant, multi-million-dollar irrigation systems were dry. Marcus kept his gates open. He didn't hide his success, nor did he gloat. He continued to refine his system, adding a solar-powered filtration array and expanding his storage capacity. He knew that the crisis was going to get worse before it got better. He spent his mornings tending to his crops, which were thriving on the consistent, cool irrigation provided by the star well. He had engineered the system to be redundant, with overflow valves that directed excess water into a series of swales he had dug around his orchard. Nothing was wasted, every drop was accounted for in Marcus's grand design. As the construction of the star-shaped well entered its final phase, Marcus Henderson became a ghost on his own land, a shadow moving within a shadow. The physical demands of the project were secondary to the mental strain of precision. Every point of the six-armed star had to be perfectly symmetrical to ensure that the structural pressure from the surrounding Earth was distributed evenly. He used a series of tension gauges and plumb lines that he had modified himself, checking the alignment of the volcanic rock slabs every few inches. The neighbors still passed by, their laughter now replaced by a quiet, judgmental silence. They saw a man obsessed with a shape, failing to realize that the shape was the only thing standing between his legacy and the encroaching dust. Marcus spent hours hand-grinding the edges of the porous stone, ensuring that each piece locked into the next with the accuracy of a watchmaker's gears. He used a mixture of bentonite clay and pulverized limestone to seal the outer seams, creating a semi-permeable barrier that would allow water to seep in while keeping the fine silt of the Nebraska panhandle out. The technical depth of the star well was a marvel of hidden engineering. Marcus had calculated that the total surface area of his star-shaped design was exactly 4 times greater than that of a standard circular well with the same central diameter. This wasn't just a marginal improvement, it was a fundamental shift in how the aquifer was accessed. In a traditional well, the water had to fight through a narrow bottleneck of soil. In Marcus's well, the water was invited in through 6 long, tapered corridors of highly porous rock. He had essentially created a subterranean vacuum that pulled moisture from a much wider radius than any other well in the county. He documented every measurement in a leather-bound ledger, the depth of 47, 3 feet, the 60-degree angles of the points, the 12-inch thickness of the volcanic lining, and the estimated recharge rate of 12,000 gallons per day. He knew these numbers by heart, and they were the only things that kept him sane as the sky turned a bruised, cloudless purple and the birds stopped singing in the scorched elms. Then came the great dry. It didn't arrive with a bang or a sudden storm. It arrived as a slow, suffocating blanket of heat that refused to lift. By early August, the temperature at Oak Haven reached 112 degrees Fahrenheit and stayed there for 14 consecutive days. The humidity dropped to single digits, and the wind, usually a welcome breeze, became a localized blowtorch that stripped the remaining moisture from the soil in hours. The regional weather service began using words like unprecedented and catastrophic. The drought of 50 years ago, the one the old-timers always talked about, was being eclipsed in real time. The creek beds didn't just dry up, they cracked so deeply that a man could lose a boot in the fissures. The smell of the air changed from the scent of dry grass to the acrid, metallic tang of scorched earth and dying vegetation. Silas was the first to lose his herd. His primary well, a massive 200-foot deep industrial shaft that had cost him $40,000 10 years ago, began to cough up a thick, gray slurry of sand and ancient silt. By the 3rd day of the heat wave, the pump burned out with a screeching mechanical wail that could be heard across the valley. Silas stood by the dry trough, watching his Angus cattle huddle in the meager shade of a dying oak, their ribs showing and their eyes clouded with dust. He had no choice but to call the livestock auction and sell them for pennies on the dollar, just to keep them from dropping dead in the field. The town was a landscape of heartbreak. The municipal water tower was nearly empty, and the mayor had declared a state of emergency, forbidding any water use except for human consumption. People were washing their faces with damp cloths and praying for a rain that the satellite maps said was nowhere near. In the midst of this desolation, Marcus Henderson's farm remained an impossible island of green. From the air, it would have looked like an emerald set in a sea of hammered brass. His tomatoes were heavy on the vine, their skins taut and glowing with health. His corn, though modest in acreage, stood 6 feet tall, its silk a vibrant, healthy purple. The secret was the star. While every other well in the region was fighting for the dwindling, receding water table that was sinking deeper into the earth, Marcus's star well was drawing from the very atmospheric and subterranean pressure differences he had engineered. The 6 arms of the star acted like cooling fins, and the temperature differential between the deep earth and the surface created a natural condensation effect inside the well. He wasn't just drawing from the aquifer, he was harvesting the earth's own breath. The validation began on a Tuesday morning, the hottest day yet. A caravan of 3 dusty pickup trucks pulled up to Marcus's gate. It was Silas Miller and a younger farmer named Greg who had just moved his family to the area 2 years prior. They didn't come with insults this time. They didn't come with jokes about stargazing. They came with empty plastic tanks and a look of profound, hollow-eyed desperation. Silas was the one who spoke. He didn't look Marcus in the eye. He looked at the ground, at the lush, green clover growing around Marcus's boots. He told Marcus that his wife was sick from the heat and they didn't have enough water to flush the toilets, let alone drink. He asked if the star had anything left to give, or if Marcus was just as dry as the rest of them. Marcus didn't say a word. He walked over to the hand-cranked secondary pump he had installed over the star's central hub. He gestured for Miller to bring his tank forward. With a steady, rhythmic motion, Marcus began to pump. For a few seconds, there was only the sound of the mechanical gears, and then a sound that seemed like a miracle in the 115-degree heat, the splash of cold, clear water hitting the bottom of the plastic tank. The water was so cold that condensation immediately formed on the outside of the container. Silas reached out a shaking hand and touched the water, his fingers trailing through the stream. He brought his hand to his face, his eyes closing as the moisture hit his skin. He began to weep, the tears leaving clean tracks through the thick dust on his cheeks. Word spread through Oak Haven like a wildfire. By that evening, there was a line of vehicles stretching half a mile down the gravel road. Marcus Henderson, the man they had mocked, the man whose well they had called a folly, was now the only thing keeping the community alive. He worked through the night, coordinating the distribution of water. He refused to take a single cent from anyone. He told them that the water belonged to the land, and he was just the architect who had invited it back. He had calculated that even with the entire town drawing from the well, the recharge rate of the star-shaped structure was so high that the water level only dropped by 4 inches every 12 hours. It was an infinite fountain in a dying world. People began to bring their children just to see the well. They would stand at the edge of the star-shaped opening, feeling the cool air rising from the depths. They looked down at the 6-pointed structure, finally understanding the genius of the geometry. The star wasn't a whim, it was a net. It was a way to catch the life that everyone else had let slip through their fingers. Marcus stood by, his lean frame silhouetted against the setting sun, explaining the physics to anyone who would listen. He talked about hydraulic conductivity and the way the volcanic rock filtered the water. He showed them the ledger, the measurements, and the math. He wanted them to understand that this wasn't magic. It was innovation born of necessity and tempered by the willingness to be laughed at. As the drought stretched into its second month, the legacy of the star well began to take root in the minds of the people. They realized that the old ways, the ways of their grandfathers, were no longer sufficient for the world they were inheriting. They saw that Marcus hadn't just saved their livestock and their gardens, he had saved their hope. He had proven that one man, armed with a different perspective and the courage to pursue an unconventional truth, could change the fate of an entire region. The Henderson star became a symbol of resilience. The crisis eventually broke with a massive thunderstorm in late September, but the lessons of the summer remained. Marcus Henderson didn't go back to his quiet, solitary life. He became a teacher. He helped Silas and Miller redesign their own wells, showing them how to excavate the radiating arms and how to source the porous rock needed for the lining. He shared his notebooks and his ledgers, holding workshops in his barn for farmers from 3 different states who had heard the legend of the star that never ran dry. He told them that innovation wasn't about having the most expensive equipment. It was about having the most expansive vision. The legacy of Marcus's work can still be seen across the high plains today. If you fly over the region, you will see them small, star-shaped structures dotting the landscape, each one a testament to the man who refused to dig a circle. These wells have allowed the small family farms to survive even as the corporate giants struggle with the changing climate. The technique has been adapted for irrigation, for livestock, and for municipal systems, always maintaining that crucial 6-pointed geometry that Marcus perfected in the dust of the Nebraska Panhandle. Marcus's philosophy on knowledge sharing was simple. Water is a common right, but the wisdom to find it is a common responsibility. He spent his final years traveling, helping drought-stricken communities around the world implement his design. He lived to see the star well used in the Sahel region of Africa and the high deserts of South America. He always maintained that the most difficult part of the process wasn't the digging. It was the bravery required to be different when everyone else was content to be the same. He believed that the greatest innovation in human history wasn't the wheel or the steam engine, but the moment someone looked at a problem and decided that the traditional answer was no longer good enough. The story of the star well is more than a story about farming or geology. It is a story about the human spirit's ability to find light in the darkest of places or, in this case, to find water in the driest of earths. It reminds us that when the world tells us we are crazy, it might just be because they are looking at the circle while we are looking at the stars. Marcus Henderson died a wealthy man, not in currency, but in the gratitude of thousands of families who still drink from the wells he inspired. He proved that even in the middle of the worst drought in 50 years, a man can still find a way to make the desert bloom if only he is willing to dig a little deeper and think a little differently than the rest. The construction process was not merely an act of physical labor. It was a rhythmic, almost meditative battle against the stubborn density of the Nebraska soil. Every Monday morning, Marcus would descend into the star-shaped pit as the first gray light of dawn began to bleed over the horizon. He would start with the northern arm of the star, the one he had designated as the primary intake for the northernmost subterranean fissure. The tools he used were not modern, high-speed drills that would have pulverized the geological layers, but hand-forged chisels and a 3-pound sledgehammer. He needed to feel the resistance of the earth. He needed to know exactly when he transitioned from the topsoil to the caliche, and from the caliche to the ancient, compressed silt that held the memory of forgotten oceans. He could have used a backhoe to rough out the shape in a single afternoon. He could have hired a crew from the city to blast through the rock with dynamite. He could have accepted the offer from the local cooperative to install a standard steel casing, but he didn't. Marcus knew that the vibrations of heavy machinery would collapse the very micro-fissures he was trying to tap. He knew that the heat of a drill bit would glaze the sides of the well, sealing off the pores of the earth like a layer of glass. Instead, he worked with the precision of a sculptor. By the third month, the walls of the star-shaped well were so smooth they looked like they had been polished by the passage of time rather than the strike of a hammer. He spent 16 hours a day in the cooling dark, his world reduced to the 6-inch diameter of his headlamp's beam and the sharp, rhythmic clink of metal on stone. The technical specifications of the volcanic rock lining were a source of constant curiosity and ridicule in Oak Haven. Marcus had sourced 3 tons of scoria from a dormant volcanic field in the high desert of New Mexico. This rock was naturally vesicular, meaning it was filled with tiny, interconnected air pockets that made it incredibly lightweight but structurally resilient. Most importantly, it was a natural capillary system. When the atmospheric pressure on the surface dropped, the scoria would actually draw moisture out of the surrounding soil, acting like a giant, stony sponge. He hand-cut each block into a trapezoidal wedge, ensuring that when they were stacked within the stars' points, they created a self-locking arch. He didn't use a drop of traditional mortar. Instead, he used a slurry made from the very clay he had excavated, mixed with wood ash and a small amount of linseed oil. This created a flexible, breathable bond that would not crack during the inevitable shifts of the Earth. By mid-June, the depth had reached 42 feet, and the internal temperature of the well remained a constant 54 degrees, even as the surface temperature climbed toward 90. The skepticism from the community had shifted from loud mockery to a kind of hushed, suspicious observation. People would stop their cars on the shoulder of the road and just stare at the mountain of red dirt Marcus had hauled up by hand. They talked about him at the Oak Haven diner over coffee that was increasingly bitter as the local water supply began to taste of sulfur and old pipes. Silas told the crowd that Marcus was building a monument to his own stubbornness. He said that a man who spends that much time underground eventually starts thinking like a mole, losing sight of the sky and the common sense that God gave a squirrel. Marcus heard the stories, but he didn't respond. He had a different kind of data to focus on. He had installed a series of homemade barometers at different levels of the well, and he was tracking the relationship between the surface humidity and the rate of seepage in the star's arms. He discovered that the star shape created a localized low-pressure zone. As wind moved across the top of the well, it created a Venturi effect, slightly lowering the air pressure inside the shaft. This pressure differential encouraged the subterranean water to move toward the well, following the path of least resistance through the porous volcanic lining. It was a passive, self-powering pump that relied on the physics of the atmosphere rather than the burning of fossil fuels. The crisis did not arrive as a single event, but as a series of mounting failures. First, the morning dew stopped appearing. The farmers woke up to grass that was already brittle and gray at 5 a.m. Then, the birds began to disappear, moving further north toward the river valleys that still held a glimmer of moisture. By July, the sky had taken on a permanent, hazy yellow tint, the result of topsoil being lifted from the fallow fields and suspended in the stagnant air. The heat became a physical presence, a weight that pressed down on the shoulders of every living thing in the county. The regional aquifer, already taxed by decades of intensive center pivot irrigation, began to collapse. In town, the situation was becoming dire. The municipal well, which had served Oak Haven since 1924, began to surge with air. The water that did come out of the taps was a lukewarm, tea-colored liquid that left a gritty residue on everything it touched. The city council met in an emergency session and voted to cut off all non-essential water usage. This meant the end of the line for the small home gardens that provided the winter's food for many families. It meant the end of the town's small park, where the century-old elms began to drop their leaves in a desperate bid to survive. The local economy, built entirely on the success of the soil, began to shudder. The hardware store stopped selling seeds and started selling oversized water tanks and heavy-duty tie-down straps. The extreme conditions were described by the local elders as a living death for the land. They remembered the droughts of the 50s, but this was different. The heat was more intense, the humidity lower, and the resilience of the soil had been depleted by years of chemical fertilizers. The ground didn't just dry out, it became hydrophobic, repelling any moisture that might have fallen. In the fields surrounding Marcus's property, the corn stalks looked like skeletons, their leaves rattling in the wind with a sound like dry parchment. The cattle, those that hadn't been sold off yet, stood with their heads hanging low, their breath coming in shallow, dusty rasps. Amidst this landscape of despair, Marcus Henderson's star well became a beacon. He had completed the final structural checks just days before the municipal supply failed completely. He had watched as the water level in the central hexagon rose steadily, day by day, fueled by the invisible rivers that his star points had intercepted. The water was crystalline, purified by 40 feet of earth and the charcoal-infused mortar of the lining. It was rich in minerals and carried the deep, resonant chill of the subterranean world. When Marcus took his first drink from the well, the sensation was so profound he had to sit down. It wasn't just water. It was the validation of every hour of labor, every sneer from a neighbor, and every calculated risk he had taken. The first person to officially ask for help was not Silas, but Greg, the young farmer from the neighboring section. Greg had a 3-year-old daughter and a wife who was 6 months pregnant. Their well had gone dry 3 days prior, and they had been survives on bottled water they bought at a premium in the city. Greg showed up at Marcus's porch at sunset, his hat in his hands, his face a mask of shame and exhaustion. He didn't even have to ask. Marcus simply handed him a 5-gallon bucket and pointed toward the star well. He told Greg to take what he needed, but to take it slowly, to respect the rhythm of the earth. As Greg lowered the bucket into the star-shaped opening, the sound of it hitting the water echoed up the shaft a deep, hollow splash that sounded like music. When he hauled it back up, the water was so clear it looked like liquid glass. Greg drank right there, his eyes widening at the coldness of it. He filled 3 more containers, his hands shaking with a mixture of relief and disbelief. He asked Marcus how it was possible. He asked why this hole in the ground was full of water when every other well for 50 miles was a tomb of dust. Marcus took Greg down into the well, leading him down the narrow, hand-carved stone stairs that wound around the central shaft. As they descended, the temperature dropped 20 degrees. Marcus showed him the 6 points of the star. He pointed to the weeping walls of the scoria rock, where beads of water were forming and merging into small, silver streams that trickled down into the central pool. He explained the pressure gradients, the surface area calculations, and the way the geometry of the star created a natural vortex. He showed him the ledger where he had recorded the geological layers. Greg listened in silence, a man seeing the world through a new lens for the first time. He realized that while they had all been trying to force the Earth to give up its secrets, Marcus had been listening to them. The following morning, the caravan of trucks began. It started with the people Marcus had known his whole life, the ones who had been the loudest in their criticism. They came with a mix of humility and desperation that was hard to watch. Marcus didn't make them apologize. He didn't remind them of the names they had called him. He simply organized them into a line and gave them a schedule. He turned his farm into a community water station, setting up a series of overflow tanks and a gravity-fed trough for any livestock that were still in the area. The emotional moments of survival were woven into the daily routine of the well. There was the elderly Mrs. Gable, who brought her dying rose bushes in small pots, begging Marcus for just a cup of water to keep them alive. There was Miller, the hardware store owner, who admitted that he had almost closed his doors for good until the water from the Star well allowed him to keep his cooling system running. The well wasn't just providing a resource, it was providing a reason to keep going. It was a physical manifestation of the idea that innovation is the most powerful tool for community survival. As the weeks passed, Marcus's philosophy on sharing knowledge became the central theme of the town's recovery. He didn't just give away water, he gave away the design. He spent his evenings sitting on the edge of the well with the local farmers, sketching the star shape in the dust with a stick. He explained that the circle was a shape of containment, but the star was a shape of connection. He told them that in the new world they were entering, they couldn't afford to be contained. They had to reach out into the earth just as they had to reach out to each other. He encouraged them to start digging their own star wells as soon as the ground softened, offering his tools and escoria rock samples to anyone willing to put in the work. The legacy of the Marcus Henderson Star well began to spread far beyond the borders of the county. A reporter from a national agricultural magazine heard the story and traveled to Oak Haven to see the miracle in the dust. The resulting article, titled "The Geometry of Survival," featured a photograph of Marcus standing over the well, the sun setting behind him and a line of thirsty neighbors stretching into the distance. The image became a symbol of a new kind of homesteading, one that combined ancient wisdom with modern physics. Architects and hydrologists began to visit the farm, taking measurements and soil samples. They discovered that Marcus's design was even more efficient than he had calculated. The star shape, they found, created a unique thermal chimney effect that helped oxygenate the water, preventing the growth of harmful bacteria that often plagued stagnant wells during heat waves. The volcanic rock lining was found to be a superior filter, removing even the smallest particulates and neutralizing the acidity caused by agricultural runoff. Marcus's folly was being recognized as a masterpiece of sustainable engineering. By the time the rains finally returned in late September, a slow, soaking drizzle that lasted for 3 days, the town of Oak Haven had been transformed. The crisis had broken the old social hierarchies and replaced them with a new sense of mutual reliance. People didn't talk about their property lines as much as they talked about the shared aquifer. They didn't brag about their individual success as much as they discussed the collective resilience of the community. And at the center of it all was the star-shaped well, a permanent reminder of the man who looked at a dry patch of earth and saw a constellation. The long-term impact of Marcus's innovation was felt for generations. Within 5 years, over 200 star wells had been constructed across the Midwest, each one tailored to the specific geology of its location. The Henderson method became a standard part of the curriculum in agricultural colleges, taught as a primary example of biomimetic hydrology. The star wells allowed small-scale farmers to remain competitive, providing them with a reliable, low-cost water source that wasn't dependent on the fluctuating prices of electricity or the whims of corporate water managers. Marcus himself lived to see his 95th birthday, and he spent nearly every day of those final years near his well. He didn't consider himself a hero or a genius. He saw himself as a man who had simply paid attention. He often told the younger generation that the earth is always talking to us, but it usually speaks in whispers. It speaks in the way the grass turns toward the sun, in the way the wind moves through the canyons, and in the way the water hides in the deep, dark places. He believed that our job is not to shout over the earth, but to learn its language. The profound lesson of Marcus Henderson's life was that innovation requires a specific kind of courage, the courage to be misunderstood. He showed that true progress often looks like madness to those who are comfortable with the status quo. He proved that the most unconventional solutions are often the ones that are most deeply rooted in the fundamental truths of nature. His star well remains today, nearly 80 years after it was first dug, and it has never once run dry. Even in the face of changing climates and increasing scarcity, the water continues to rise, cold and clear, a silver star reflecting the enduring power of a single, brilliant idea. The expansion of the star well's architecture required Marcus to become an amateur geologist, a structural engineer, and a historian of the Earth all at once. He spent his nights poring over old topographical maps from the 1930s, looking for the ghost rivers that had once carved their way through the limestone bedrock. He realized that the traditional circular well was a passive recipient of water, waiting for the aquifer to push moisture into its center. His star well was an active predator of moisture. The 6 arms of the star were designed to create a localized pressure drop, effectively sucking the humidity out of the surrounding soil through the process of capillary action. He measured the porosity of his scoria, a rock, at precisely 28%, meaning that nearly a third of the stone's volume was dedicated to the movement of water. This wasn't just a wall, it was a vertical river. During the 18th week of construction, the physical labor reached a point of almost unbearable intensity. Marcus was working at a depth of 52 feet, far below the level where the summer heat could reach him. The air at the bottom was thick with the scent of wet stone and the metallic tang of the breaker bar. He could have hired a local teenager to help him haul the buckets of debris to the surface. He could have installed an electric winch to save his shoulders from the grueling weight of the clay. He could have used a modern pump to clear out the seepage that was already beginning to collect at his feet. But he didn't. Marcus wanted to be present for every inch of the excavation. He wanted his hands to be the first things to touch the water that had been trapped in the dark for 10,000 years. The technical innovations extended to the very stairs he used to descend. Instead of a wooden ladder that would eventually rot in the damp environment, Marcus carved a spiral staircase directly into the walls of the central hexagon. Each step was reinforced with the same volcanic rock as the lining, creating a structural ribbing that further strengthened the well against the inward pressure of the earth. He calculated that the weight of the water at full capacity would exert over 15 pounds of pressure per square inch against the floor of the well. To counter this, he designed a concave floor, a shallow bowl made of polished granite that focused the weight toward the center, preventing the star's arms from buckling. The community's mockery began to turn into a strange, uneasy fascination as the heat wave deepened. The local news station from the city sent a reporter out to interview the man digging the star hole. The reporter asked Marcus if he was looking for gold or if he was trying to build a bunker for the end of the world. Marcus didn't look at the camera. He told the reporter that he was looking for a future that didn't depend on a crumbling infrastructure. He said that the Earth was the only bank that never went bankrupt, provided you knew how to make a deposit. The neighbors watched the broadcast in the Oak Haven diner, shaking their heads. They called him a survivalist, a crank, and a fool who was digging his own grave. But they also noticed that Marcus's pond was still full and his trees hadn't started to drop their leaves. The crisis of the Great Dry reached its zenith in the 3rd week of August. The temperature in the shade hit 118 degrees, a number that seemed physically impossible for the Nebraska plains. The wind was so dry it felt like it was pulling the moisture directly out of a person's lungs. In the town of Oak Haven, the psychological toll was becoming evident. People were snapping at each other in the grocery store over the last of the bottled water. There were rumors of people sneaking onto neighbors' properties at night to siphon water from their stagnant swimming pools. The sense of community, which had always been the pride of the county, was fraying at the edges. Silas, the old farmer who had lived next to Marcus for half a century, was the hardest hit. He had spent his entire life following the rules, planting his crops in straight lines and digging his wells in perfect circles. He had trusted the government to manage the reservoir and the corporations to manage the seed. Now, at 74 years old, he was watching his legacy turn to ash. He walked his fields every morning, the dry corn stalks cutting his arms like serrated knives. He could have complained to the county commissioners. He could have waited for a federal disaster relief check. He could have given up and moved to the city to live with his daughter, but he didn't. He drove his old Chevy to the edge of Marcus's property and sat there for 3 hours, watching the Star Well's silver arm move in the wind. The validation of the Star Well came not as a sudden event, but as a steady, quiet miracle. While the municipal water tower groaned under the weight of its own emptiness, Marcus's well was producing 400 gallons of water every hour. He had installed a series of gravity-fed troughs that led from the well to his lower pasture. He didn't just have enough for his own garden. He had enough to sustain a small ecosystem. The birds returned to his farm first, their songs a jarring contrast to the silence of the surrounding properties. Then came the small woodland creatures, the rabbits, the deer, and the foxes, all drawn by the scent of water that Marcus refused to fence off. The day the town officially ran out of water was a Friday. The mayor had to announce over the local radio that the pumps had officially failed and that the reservoir was nothing more than a mudflat. Within an hour, the first line of cars appeared at Marcus's gate. These were the people who had laughed the loudest. These were the men who had called the star a waste of time and the volcanic rock a gimmick. Marcus stood at the entrance to his drive, his hands in his pockets. He didn't look for apologies. He didn't ask for a confession of their errors. He simply handed out a set of rules: 100 gallons per family per day, no washing cars, and no watering lawns. The water was for living, not for looking at. The emotional weight of the scene was overwhelming. The Miller family, who had lost their youngest son to a heat-related illness just 2 days prior, arrived with their tanks in the back of a rusted flatbed. They were silent, their faces etched with a grief that no amount of water could wash away. When the first gallon of cold, clear liquid hit their container, Mrs. Miller let out a sound that was half sob and half laugh. She looked at Marcus and told him that she finally understood. She said that they had been looking for solutions in the sky, while he had been looking for them in the heart of the earth. As the validation continued, Marcus began to share the technical data that had made the well possible. He set up a chalkboard on the side of his barn and began to give daily lectures to the men waiting in line. He showed them the relationship between the 60-degree angles of the star and the structural integrity of the volcanic lining. He explained how the different layers of the earth, the clay, the silt, the gravel acted as a multi-stage filtration system. He taught them about the thermal properties of the deep earth and how to use the temperature differential to create a natural vacuum. He wasn't just giving them water, he was giving them a new way of thinking about the world they lived in. The legacy of the Star Well began to take shape even before the drought ended. A group of younger farmers, led by Greg, began to organize a cooperative to implement Marcus's design across the county. They called it the Star Project. They didn't have the money for expensive drilling rigs, but they had the labor and they had the blueprint. Under Marcus's supervision, they began the first communal star well in the center of the town park. It was a slow, difficult process, but it brought the community together in a way that prosperity never could. They were no longer a collection of individuals fighting for their own survival. They were a tribe building a future together. The spread of the technique across the region was documented by agricultural scientists from 3 different universities. They found that the star wells were not only more resilient than traditional designs, but they also had a positive impact on the local water table. By encouraging seepage rather than just extraction, the wells were acting as a form of managed aquifer recharge. The star points were essentially feeding the Earth as much as they were taking from it. The Henderson method was officially recognized as a breakthrough in regenerative hydrology. Marcus's philosophy on innovation and perseverance was summarized in the final entry of his construction ledger. He wrote that the greatest obstacle to human progress is not the lack of resources, but the presence of tradition. He believed that we are often blinded by the way things have always been done, making it impossible to see the way things could be. He wrote that the star was not a symbol of his own brilliance, but a symbol of his willingness to be wrong in the eyes of the world. He believed that every great discovery in history began with a man or a woman standing in a field, holding a length of twine and a few cedar stakes, and deciding to draw a different shape in the dirt. As the years passed, the star wells of Oak Haven became a point of pilgrimage for people from all over the world. They came to see the structures that had saved a town from the brink of extinction. They came to meet the man who had turned a drought into a masterclass in engineering. Marcus stayed on his farm, tending to his garden and his well, until the day he died. He never charged for his knowledge, and he never patented his design. He believed that the Earth's secrets belonged to everyone who was brave enough to listen to them. The final legacy of Marcus Henderson is not found in the textbooks or the scientific journals, although his name is certainly there. It is found in the cool, clear water that still flows from the hundreds of star wells that now dot the American landscape. It is found in the green orchards that grow in places where the desert once threatened to take over. And it is found in the stories told by the children of Oak Haven, who grow up knowing that when the world tells you to dig a circle, the smartest thing you can do is look at the stars and start digging a different shape altogether. The profound lesson of the star well is that survival is not just about having what you need. It is about knowing how to find it when everyone else says it is gone. It is about the power of the human mind to see patterns where others see chaos. It is about the courage to stand in the heat and the dust and the mockery and keep digging until you find the truth. Marcus Henderson didn't just build a well. He built a bridge between the ancient wisdom of the earth and the future of the human race. And as long as the stars are in the sky and the water is in the ground, his legacy will continue to flow cold and clear and life-giving for all who are thirsty enough to seek it out.